Befitting his cult status, Williams became the voice of Will-o'-the-Wisp in the 5-minute animation slot before the evening news. Willow had begun in 1975 as an educational short for British Gas, a pilot flame with twinkling eyes and a 2-tier nose. Willow lived in a magical wood with his friends, a dumpy fairy called Mavis Cruitt, who was searching for romance, and Arthur the Cockney Caterpillar. Williams supplied all the voices, with hints of repressed innuendo. Younger children would never guess at the double meanings. That was what made Williams such an artful cult. All Williams's restraint was ditched for just a minute. Ian Messiter would set him questions that pandered to his historical tastes, for classical philosophers, medieval painters, and post-Renaissance monarchs. Giotto, paleontology, and the Marie Celeste were just a few of the recherché topics he was invited to discourse upon in the early 80s.
Kenneth, the subject is rules, which we have in this show, which I try and interpret, and there's 1 minute to talk about them starting now.
Rules are made to be broken by geniuses. Michelangelo is a case in point. So, of course, is John McEnroe, and I am among this group as well.
Nicholas Parsons tried to protect Williams from cavils by other players. Williams repaid his consideration with cruelty, both on stage and behind the scenes. Williams boiled with spite. Parsons was death. He's an awful chairman. And he dithered and dithered so much that the programme never got underway. Williams lacked that self-awareness to know what others felt about him when their feelings were disguised. He could give offence and be told later that he was forgiven, and would be honestly surprised to realise years later that his friend had never forgotten the hurt. When David Porter invited Williams to direct Orton's Lute for the Lyric Theatre, he accepted immediately. Within 2 weeks, rehearsals were over. Williams directed with the practical approach that he took to washing the walls or buying a raincoat. He remembered Orton's intentions for the set and followed them. He expected moves to be crisp, lines to be audible, and actors to be natural. There wasn't any kind of directorial spin, and that was the strength of the production, Porter said. It allowed the true voice of Orton to come through, and the play was incredibly funny. The run was sold out, and the notices were excellent.
We got the company together, rehearsed, and all of them don't know each other, don't forget, so my prime object was to create an atmosphere which the people become uninhibited in, and then having established the rhythms, the kind of natural climaxes that are in the script, I thought, well, this is going rather well. I watched the preview, and I thought, it's all a bit too good to be true. In fact, I wrote in my diary, on the Friday morning, it's too good to be true.
After the tension of the first night, Williams was jolted to receive a call from Porter, warning that the leading actor had been in an altercation, and with 16 stitches in his face, would not be able to perform. There was no understudy, so Williams picked up the inscribed copy of the play that Orton had given him and ordered a 2 p.m. rehearsal. Kenneth came in visibly excited by the whole thing, Porter said. He was going to do the whole part reading from a clipboard, which would suit the character. The excitement within the building was absolutely immense. Within half an hour of us making that decision, the phones just never stopped. It was sold out. It was an outrageous evening. Kenneth's performance was camp. It was completely different to how he directed the show. Of course, the audience loved it. It was almost impossible for the cast because they were being upstaged and corpsed, but it was very, very funny. During the early 80s, Williams earned more money than he had ever banked before, with work that was often desultory. A BP commercial shot in a day, encouraging customers to save energy, had him dressed up as a devil in horns and a velvet cape, and earned him more than 5 weeks filming at Pinewood. The manuscript of his life story was written in cramped copper plate, in light pencil, the strokes almost too faint and too constricted to be legible. His diary, by contrast, was almost always in ink, and if a word was smudged or scrawled, he would write it again, above the line, in small block capitals. For dramatic and significant events, a burglary, a reassuring phone call, a blister, he used thick felt tip to print his words. But by his 50s, the days were written up in a uniform schoolboy script, and when he didn't feel like saying much, he let the margins expand so that the entry became a wedge of blue down the middle of the page. He still used red ink to highlight all his twinges and capitals to emphasise stray words. Each entry still began with a verdict on his morning bowel movement. The details of his ailments and medicines pattered into his diary. He could not take a pill for a headache or insomnia or indigestion without recording it and commenting on the effect.
Oh, I would go to the doctor every single time I've got any kind of pain, yes. I mean, I know the great man remarked the best thing to do about health is ignore it. And that's fine for the average healthy person, I suppose. But if you've got people around you sneezing violently with all the germs invading the room, you immediately think, well, I'm going to get out of here, you know. And people say, oh, that's ridiculous. You're being awfully squeamish, aren't you? You're hypochondriac or something.
He felt his mother's illnesses with the terror of death that most people experience only on their own account. Cuts, blisters, rashes, the type of irritations that Louis might have thought too trivial to notice, fretted her son to distraction. He counted the days it took for a bruise to subside if she banged her arm, or a scab to heal if she knocked her ankle. When she saw a doctor, Williams would try to snatch a few words in private, to press for a deeper diagnosis. The thought that she could die was too awful to contemplate. He could not be there every night, though, and at the beginning of June 1984, he was shuttling to Manchester for a game show. The next day, Louis failed to recognise her daughter in the street. Her speech was affected. Not so much impaired as slowed. Words formed laboriously as opposed to her old style of rapid delivery. He believed his mother was sliding into senility, fighting the shadows that are closing in round her, and that he would have not only to watch, but to cope as well, as she died one day at a time. It was an intolerable duty. God, I'd like to be miles away from all kin at the moment. At the end of January 1987, he went into Charing Cross Hospital for a gastroscopy, and a gastric ulcer was diagnosed. The pain abated with treatment, but other complaints spattered the day planner. He complained incessantly, until he began to tire even good friends. His illnesses had always been a favourite topic for him, but the people who loved him best had been able to make a joke of it once. By the time he reached his 60s, Williams was turning down dinner invitations because his diet was so limited, and was seeing less of his friends. Williams told his doctors that the pain of his ulcer and the strain of seeing his mother decline into senility was making him suicidal. During the last 2 years of his life, there was no respite, either from the pain and worry or from the depression. Nobody should live past 65, he told a friend, because nobody should have to face deterioration. In his kitchen was a large jar of pills, sedatives, synthetic barbiturates such as mandrax. The existence of this stash since around 1970 suggests paradoxically that Williams was not at risk of harming himself. Nowhere in the diary does he muse seriously about the mechanics of suicide, of how many pills he would need to swallow, and how fast they would act. By mid-March 1988, the ulcer tormented him every hour of the day. He could hardly speak or bear to be with anyone, and he was frightened to eat. The day before his gastroscopy, he had recorded his last voiceover, an AA advert with Brian Blessed and Brian Pringle. It was lovely being with actors again. Oh, I do enjoy their company. He cancelled an interview on HTV and withdrew from the next recording of Just a Minute. On Thursday the 14th of April, the pain in his bowel was like rats gnawing at your belly, and he could not eat in the morning. Hunger left him tired and faint. In despair, he rang the hospital to ask whether he could be booked in for an operation, and was told he would have to wait until the end of the month at least. He went to Louis's flat for tea, and they watched television until 8:45 p.m, when he told her he was in pain and wanted an early night. His last words were to remind her that they both had appointments at the chiropodist's the next morning, and that she had to be ready to go out at 10:30 a.m. He had arranged to meet Paul Richardson, his neighbour and friend, later for lunch at the BBC in Portland Place. He made his final entry in his diary that night. Pain in the back was pulsating as it's never done before. So this, plus the stomach trouble, combines to torture me. Oh, what's the bloody point? Going to the kitchen, he took several sleeping tablets from his jar of exit pills, with a glass of wine or gin, and went to bed. Williams was meticulous in charting his use of prescription medicine, and it is clear that the barbiturates were not his usual sleeping aids. During the early hours of the morning, he suffered a cardiac arrest, brought on by the levels of barbiturate and other drug traces in his blood, and died. His pathologist later suggested there was not enough of any substance to kill him on its own, but in combination the drugs had proved fatal. He identified barbiturates and amphetamines. But Kenneth Williams never took medication for his depressions. Within the previous 3 weeks, he had started taking 2 Zantac pills where Dr. Clark had prescribed only 1. The relief this effected from the pain had surprised him. It was this drug that apparently showed up as a stimulant in the pathologist's examination. The findings imply strongly that Williams had not swallowed enough sleeping tablets for the barbiturates alone to kill him. They reacted with the stomach medicine he habitually used, and which he had recently taken in greater quantities. This accidental combination provoked his fatal heart attack. The last words he wrote were not a suicide note. He had written almost exactly the same 40 years earlier. Oh, what the hell? What's the good? What's the bloody use of it all? He had not said goodbye to Louis, and his final actions, though reckless, were not clear-cut. If he had been entirely set on killing himself, he could have swallowed many more pills.
Kenneth Williams, one of the great radio comedians and a regular star of the Carry On films, has died at the age of 62.
It is impossible not to speculate on what Williams might have achieved if he had dared. If he had gone to New York to play the fool to Orson Welles' King Lear. If he had taken Pieces of Eight to Broadway and bewitched America. If he had tried a sitcom or a detective series. If he had directed on the West End. Williams knew what he was denying himself. He never wished to consummate his success. Williams made no provision for the survival or publication of his diaries. Full publication is difficult. Williams had no regard for other people's privacy, and he often issued moral judgments that were thoroughly libelous. It is a voyeuristic voyage like nothing else in literature. When the diaries are finally published, Williams will be appreciated as a combination of flamboyant diarist and ascetic scribe, part Pepys and part monk, one of England's outstanding writers.
Born Brilliant, The Life of Kenneth Williams by Christopher Stevens was read by Nicholas Boulton, abridged by Libby Spurrier and produced by Joanna Green. It was a peer production for BBC Radio 4, and you might like to know that the main theme music for the series was Beethoven's Spring Sonata, one of Kenneth Williams' Desert Island Discs. And Kenneth appears in Round the Horn on Monday night at 7 o'clock, and that's over on BBC Radio 7.